My name is Drew Waldron, and I am on with author, research consultant, and brain development expert, John Medina. John, how are you this morning?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Drew.
Really excited to get in this conversation. How would you describe your career to anyone who might be unfamiliar with your work?
Well, my career is really in two parts. The first part is I'm a developmental molecular biologist, and I know that's a mouthful. I have research interests in the genetics of psychiatric disorders, if that makes it a little easier. I'm deeply interested in how the brain develops at the level of cell and gene, and then what happens years later in a psychiatric behavior emerges. I've spent most of my life as a private research consultant, primarily to the biotech and pharmaceutical industries back in the day, and it's certainly broadened since then to include tech and architecture firms and a whole bunch of people. So I have my first part is pretty much a research consultant. I'm a troubleshooter, I guess you'd say it. If somebody has a problem and they need something solved and I can bring my expertise, that's what I do. So I'm a hired gun. But I have a second component to my research career now, and it's a public facing career. I'm the author of the Brain Rules series, which I wrote mostly as a myth busting exercise. But I was surprised as anybody that they became national bestsellers, and in one case, a New York Times bestseller. And they've been used as textbooks around the country. It's been translated into 20 languages. Thing kind of all blew up. I wrote it primarily, I would call it a myth busting exercise. You may have heard that you only use 10% of your brain, and of course, that's nonsense. You may have even heard this is a myth that stays persistent, that there's both a right brain personality and a left brain personality. Have you ever heard that before, Drew?
Absolutely, I have.
Yeah, you take and throw it out, okay? There's no such thing as a left brain personality and a right brain personality. You need two hemispheres to make a frickin' personality. And quite frankly, we're not even sure what a personality is. So that part of my public facing career actually took off. So I have two components, which I literally divide my day into two parts. In the morning, I do the research stuff. And in the afternoon, I do more of the communications and research explanation stuff.
After the success of your brain rules and just how you took that myth busting experiment and it led to such popularity, what is it like for all of these educators and some of the people in different business sectors to kind of look up to you and look up to your brain rules? What has that shift been like for you?
Well, it's been mostly really gratifying because if you're in the research business at any length for any length of time, you realize that you're going to have to deal with a tremendous amount of failure. So a lot of my career has been spent with these wonderful good folks telling them what we don't know about the brain. So at one level, it's an easy thing to say to the audiences that I speak to. I use the word I don't know. We don't know. We're not sure a whole lot. And all of a sudden they realize they're speaking to a real life scientist as opposed to somebody who's trying to hawk a book or trying to get a particular point of view across for whatever agenda they might have internally. I actually don't have an agenda. I would just love to know what's out there. That's a pole star that's guided my whole life. And there you are.
Absolutely. I feel like that honesty leads to some accessibility.
Yeah. Well, it can. It can also lead to a much larger view because as a scientist, if you don't care what you believe, but you would just love to know what's out there, you could approach most any question you have very cleanly, without an agenda, without a whole lot of biases, and you won't care what you find so long as what you find is, it's a small t here, truth. I have a love affair with small t truth, and I'm glad to be a part of a profession and be able to act as a tour guide to many of my audiences, telling them what we do and what we don't know about how their brains function.
I love that approach. But to delve into your work as a brain development specialist, your topics range from all ages of brains, from the behaviors of newborn babies to how seniors should practice mental wellness and keep themselves sharp. Through all of this expertise that you have, what issues and age groups do you find yourself addressing the most?
Well, that's actually pretty easy and straightforward to say. My topics are primarily the education world. So I'm very interested in people that are interested in transferring information. And so I have those consulting and teaching events have ranged from K through 12 to business practices for people that need to do career development. I've addressed entire faculties and faculty sessions, lots of interesting things about education. Almost always I say three things to them, though. Number one, I start with a bit of skepticism, as we were just describing. I tell them, we don't know in real terms very much about how the brain works. We don't know how you know how to pick up a glass of water and drink it, for example. We don't know how you know how to pick up a pen and write your name with it. And if we ever did figure all that stuff out, we'd win all kinds of prizes. So I start out with a little bit of skepticism to say that regardless of what you may have heard, we don't know all that much. But then I say a second of three things. We're not clueless. about how the brain works. And if we were, I wouldn't have had a career these last 40 years. But we know something, for example, about its evolutionary performance envelope, the conditions under which the brain actually learns and acquires, processes information the best. Here it is. The human brain appears to have been designed to solve problems related to surviving in an outdoor setting, in unstable meteorological conditions, and to do so in near constant motion. That's what it's good at. That we know is the optimum conditions under which the brain processes information of almost any stripe. So I then say to them the third thing. If that's the case, that evolutionary performance envelope is what it is, if you wanted to design a learning environment that was directly opposed to what the brain is naturally good at doing, Drew, you'd design a frickin' classroom. I mean, I teach bioengineering graduate students, and I sit there in a model in a lecture style that has not substantially changed since the 17th century, maybe even the 16th century. So I then say this, because my world, the world of the molecular neurosciences, and their world, the real world of education, don't get together very often, the best we could hope to come up with would be some research questions that we could do together if we ever were to get our expertises and pool them. And that from that, we then enter into a discussion, and I give several examples, several handholds where there could be some research fruit. Would you like to hear one?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, there's a woman named Patricia Kuhl, Kuhl. She's here at the University of Washington. She discovered almost 30 years ago something about language acquisition that is ripe for research questions that brain scientists and teachers could do together. She found that at the age of 6 months of age, an infant, a human infant, can discriminate between every phoneme. Phonemes are the sounds of language. They can discriminate between every phoneme of every language that has ever been invented. Even those click languages of Bantu or Mandarin or English. Quite literally, at 6 months of age, a native Japanese speaker can distinguish between R and L just fine. So she calls them citizens of the world because of that nice egalitarianism. But she also discovered something else, and the reason why she landed on the map. At 12 months of age, Drew, all of that nice egalitarianism has gone away. At 12 months of age, something has happened to the baby's brain. The baby can no longer discriminate between the sounds of every language that has ever been invented, but only the sounds of the language they have heard in the previous 6 months. Quite literally. A native Japanese speaker who at 6 months of age could distinguish between R and L, if they've not heard that Germanic sound in the next 6 months, will not be able to distinguish between R and L and never will again for the rest of their natural lives. That door slams pretty shut. So I have a question that I then pose to the educators. If that's the case, that's just one hallmark of a whole range of data showing how powerful language acquisition occurs in our early years, or 0 through 5. When do we teach a foreign language in the current school system today? You know when we teach it, Drew? We teach it in frickin' junior high, which is about 10 to 12 years after the developmental train has already left the station. Well, I then say, you and I, we in the cognitive neurosciences and you in the teaching classroom have a lot of work to do together if we want to optimize the system based on the little we do know about how the brain works.
Absolutely. As someone who took Spanish in the 6th grade, I feel that pain. Don't you worry. And what a great segue into the next question, just about how the modern classroom is the exact polar opposite of what the human brain is designed to function around. Speaking of opposite circumstances, over the last few years of online distance learning and heightened social media addiction and just nonstop mental stimulation, many argue that we have never lived through a period of time that has been this damaging to young minds. What is your perspective on that take?
Well, I'd say that last sentence probably would need some editing. I'm not sure that I would agree with that. But there is a problem and also a bit of a puzzle. Way before COVID happened and we had to do the distance learning, mental health issues in students were already rising, particularly the affective disorders like anxiety, depression is a part of that. They were increasing before the pandemic. And it appears that the pandemic was more acting like an accelerant to a trend that was already occurring, not one that was somehow birthed by the fact that we were in a pandemic. So that's a problem and also a bit of a puzzle. To me, It comes down to stress management and the ability to understand what stress is to the brain. Perhaps I can give an example here because
I would love that.
it's where the behavioral sciences and world of education might actually have something to say to each other. Your brain and my brain is built to handle stress pretty well. In our sojourn in the Serengeti and the sides of the Ngorongoro crater for the 6 to 8 million years we were out in the savannah, we probably ran into life-threatening situations often, maybe once a day, maybe once a week. That the stress was never the problem. Where the brain sciences make a contribution to understanding how stress works in the brain comes from the following. It's not the stress that's the problem. It's the ability to feel in control of the stress that is the problem. And here's the principle. The more out of control you feel over the stressful experience that's occurring to you, the more likely it is to hurt the brain, to, in some cases, even cause brain damage. The more in control you feel of the stressful situation coming at you, your brain might not even report it as stressful. Now, control here means, out of control particularly means you can't control the frequency of the aversive stimuli coming at you, and you can't control the severity of it once it arrives at your doorstep. Now, I can't think of a situation more out of control than an invisible virus on a droplet that when your grandfather breathes it will kill him, which is what happened in the pandemic. So those feelings of being out of control and then having to go back to a classroom maybe filled with that emotional baggage, it makes sense to me all over the any way I can think of it that the COVID would act as experience would act as an accelerant to a trend that was already starting to occur. And having said that, this whole idea of control suggests a strategy. The more in control you can feel over components of your life, the less likely they are to be stressful. And here we have a magical solution that comes right out of the behavioral sciences. It's the world of Jon Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness. Have you heard of mindfulness training before?
Not particularly.
Okay. Well, mindfulness training is a form of meditation that, and here's the magic words, is evidence-based. It's actually been tried. Jon Kabat-Zinn came up with a meditation strategy that has proven so successful that it actually could reduce anxiety and depressive rates in virtually every age group that's ever been tested, including in children and even in teenagers and young adults. So the whole idea that mindfulness, which is a way of producing control back over your environment, and that is so evidence-based that there's actually a brain science behind it, I recommend that for the classrooms of the future, given your great question about online distance learning and nonstop mental stimulation and COVID and whatnot, that mindfulness training in the way that Jon Kabat-Zinn has described it should be as necessary a component of education as an algebra class and should be taught at all grades in an effort to stem the tide of the growing mental health issues that we see in the classroom.
Wow, I love that take on the positive aspect of control, but I'd love to ask you a question about the negative aspect of control. You often speak on workplace power dynamics, specifically what giving someone power in a workplace can do to their brain.
Sure.
What trends are you seeing in the workplace currently, and what steps can be taken to combat some of those negative behaviors?
Yeah. Wow. Well, let's switch over then from
Positive to negative.
But hopefully I can end up on the positive. This is not going to be a positive story.
Oh, no.
One of the books in the brain, one of the books in the Brain Rules series is Brain Rules for Work. And in it, I talk about power. And I've been addressing various judiciaries and state legislators about what happens when you acquire power. We know power does things to people's brains and in predictable ways. And we're beginning to understand how deeply it can go. Power is going to be defined as the ability to control assets or the ability to control resources or the ability to control access to those assets or resources, which can be both human or financial or whatever. It's power. Power, when exercised, it's like fire, can either cook your food or burn your house down. We know the fulcrum choice when somebody gets newly promoted or becomes newly elected as an official, they are immediately confronted with the choice of the power they wield. They can choose the good side, which we sometimes call deontological ethics. This is about the idea is, what is the right thing to do? Is this the right thing to do? That's a deontological ethical question. But you can choose the dark side. And if you choose the dark side, we know what happens to you. The dark side would be the utilitarian ethics bucket, if you will. And that is you're not asking what is the right thing to do. It's what will confer on me an advantage. So there's no longer an appeal to something larger. Maybe you were elected to do that, or maybe you got positions of power because you thought you could do some good. But if you're not careful, because you can wield it, you can go to the dark side, and you'll choose the dark side if you start looking for things of ways to making an advantage, where you no longer have friends, you have allies, where you no longer have opponents, you have enemies. And when that happens, three things occur, and you can almost count down it, Drew. Should we go over those three things?
Absolutely.
Number one, a cognitive gadget called theory of mind goes down. We can measure it. Theory of mind is the ability to understand the intentions and motivations of somebody else. It's got two components to it. Number one, it's almost like mind reading. If you're with people who have strong theory of mind skills, they can be scary because it's like they're reading your mind. The two gadgets are this: the ability to penetrate inside someone else's psychological interiors, and with very little cueing, understand the rewards and punishment systems inside those interiors. So you're penetrating inside to understand someone else's mental life. That's why it's called a theory of mind. You're developing a theory of their mind. The second gadget, though, is the most interesting to me because it's a boundary issue. People with strong theory of mind know at all times that the person they're beaming at, that they're trying to understand, they have a set of rewards and punishment systems that are unique to themselves, but they may not be the same ones that operate in your mind. But you have the tacit realization that they are going to operate like their rules and not your rules because you are not the center of their life. I call it John Medina's second law of marriage. Here it is. What is obvious to you is obvious to you. When you acquire power, that can be beautiful skill of theory of mind begins to erode, and you begin to lose the ability to accurately decode the emotional information inside someone else's face, and you're beginning not to understand their intentions as they exist, but only as a warped version of it that would satisfy the ethical choice you made, which was to what can give me an advantage. That's the first thing that happens. Mm. Here's this. I told you this was a dark side, and it's going to get darker. You ready?
I'm ready.
Number two, your feelings of entitlement begin to go up. You begin to feel like you deserve some of the accolades. People are starting to come towards you, not because they care about you, because they don't. They care about what you could provide for them, because they may be operating on the same utilitarian ethics that you have chosen on. But I have two great quotes from researchers. If you don't mind, I'll read them. It summarizes the research nicely. They are, now here it is. This is from Kuntzman and Maynard there at Miami University of Ohio. One benefit from being atop of any social hierarchy is the relative impunity it grants from the actions or opinions of others. Your feelings of entitlement begin to go up, and you begin not to care very much about what it does to other people. The second quote is from McGee at New York University. People with power not only take what they want because they can do so unpunished, but also because they intuitively feel they are entitled to do so. So if the first thing is that your transponder's beginning to go off, you no longer can accurately decode the information inside someone else's face. The second is you're beginning not to care because you're entitled and you think you can do anything you darn well please. That's the second of three things that happen. The third one, like I said, they get darker, and here it is. For reasons we don't understand, and this actually happens to both men and women, interestingly enough, when you increase your power, you become more willing to sexualize your environment. You begin to see your world primarily in sexual terms after a period of time. We have a great term for it. It's called self-perceived mating value. Because you have acquired power, you all of a sudden are beginning to think you have greater mating value than someone else. And we do know that in both men and women, when you acquire power in the way that I have defined it, and by the way, that's Dr. Keltner's definition of it, access to resources and interpersonal resources, your testosterone levels go up. So after a while, you have this perfect storm. To answer your question in full, if you choose the good side of power, you can do a tremendous amount for a lot of people, and a whole lot of cool things can happen. But if you choose the dark side, if you go to the utilitarian section, you'll begin to lose the ability to understand the emotional environment that's around you. You begin to feel over entitled and not to care what your actions do to other people, and you want to have sex with everybody. Not a fun story.
My gosh, that really is the dark side.
Sorry.
It is what it is. If we want to get to a lighter topic of your workplace topics, another one of your topics that I really enjoy is the neuroscience behind creative, productive workspace design. Now, we already talked about certain workspace design and like how the classroom is against natural human evolutionary processes, but what companies do you believe are at the forefront of these specific innovations and why?
Well, in the last couple of years, I've started two brain research institutes in my career, and one of them, way back when, we were going to build a big building, and we were incorporating a an architecture firm called NBBJ here in Seattle, which has actually done a fair amount of work. They designed the Amazon world headquarters. They've designed Samsung's headquarters. They design hospitals. They do all kinds of things. And I've developed over the years, Drew, an absolutely delightful relationship with them because they've taken, hopefully I'm a nice guy, but I'm a pretty grumpy scientist. And so if they have a design environment and they say, I want to do this, I ask them why. That's part of a normal consulting gig that you do anyway. They have been just terrific in saying, well, we're not sure why. Can you tell us what the brain does when X, Y, and Z happens? And so I say a couple of things to them. One of them is that I introduced them to a guy who's a hero of mine. He's got mixed reputation in some corners and an absolutely stellar reputation in others. It's a guy, E.O. Wilson. He's dead now, and he created the concept of biophilia. And so that's as close as I think the world of the built environment and the education environment can get to regarding people that are interested in the brain sciences. But I tell them this just in general without being prescriptive, because from a brain science perspective, remember, we still don't know how you know how to pick up a glass of water, let alone design a world corporate headquarters. So my skepticism comes to the front. But here, these facts. We probably diverged from the chimpanzees, our nearest genetic neighbor, between 6 and 8 million years ago, depending upon the laboratory you're looking at. But what that means is this, which is extraordinary. And it has to do with biophilia, which is the idea that the outer environment and how you raise can influence and has historically influenced our behaviors and our preferences and whatnot. For 99.987% of the time, our big, fat, talented brains have been developing on the planet. We have lived in settings that are composed of natural elements. Most of our experience is not done in a glass steel structure. It's designed around a flat, arid, semi-watered savanna. That's where we grew up. From that insight, it occurs to me that if you wanted to design environments where this big fat brain is supposed to thrive, you're going to have to pay some attention to our evolutionary history, or you're just going to be throwing smoke and building another cube of some kind or another spherical shape, something that isn't brain friendly. For example, Richard Wrangham, he's a researcher, believes that we may have walked between 10 and 20 kilometers per day, 7 days a week for our entire evolutionary history. When we sit down at a desk and we don't walk 10 to 20 kilometers a day, it makes sense that the system would become derailed, and that if you could put an exercise component, insert it directly into the work experience of whatever kind, you probably would begin to optimize the system. And that, in fact, is what you find. You can find exercise actually improves cognition. It improves a particular gadget called executive function, which is the ability to get things done, which goes all the way down to the toilet if all you do is sit on your butt all day long, pooling blood around your ankles and buttocks. So whatever design you want to come up with, you have to take into account the fact that we as a creature moved all the time. Okay? Here's another one. Mm-hmm. We have an absolute love affair with our own voices. By our own, I mean our own species. Our brain just locks on. Babies, you can see this in infants most clearly. When they hear a human voice, they value it more than any other input that's in their spectrum. And if it's their mother's voice, they value it even more. But the human voice, that we lock on it, we pay all kinds of attention to it. Except if you're in an office. Now, back in the Serengeti, hearing another voice means a potential ally. This is called the social brain hypothesis of Robin Dunbar, but it's a good one. Mm-hmm. We probably survived because we could create friendships and cooperate our behaviors and coordinate them in such fashion that we could live. And if you could hear a voice, even if you couldn't see somebody, that could be a reassuring cue. That's why a lot of us think that our brains just lock down when we hear a human voice. But if you're trying to get something done at work, a human voice can piss you off. And the reason why is that your brain is designed not to work with an Excel spreadsheet. in competition with another human voice. It's designed to lock down on the human voice. And you spend a great deal of your time trying to bat it away. The worst of all, Golly and Seth Horowitz call this half-versations. The worst thing, the most distracting you can get is when you can only hear half of a conversation, like you might on a cell phone or somebody's on the phone. You can hear their responses, but you can't hear the other person's, and your brain immediately begins trying to imagine what those others might be. And even if you put headphones on, it's an artificial environment, and you're trying to blot things out. I can't think of more brain unfriendly spaces than a cubicle where you can't exercise all day and all you do is bat away conversations that you'd really like to spend a lot of attention paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man, you are making me feel guilty for not getting up and walking around for a little bit. I
Oh,
gotta do that after here.
We've been talking together, about a half hour, 35 minutes now. That amount of time in the Serengeti, Drew, we're somebody's lunch, okay?
Absolutely. Man, this has been a fantastic conversation, but I love ending most of these interviews by asking a very broad question that you can feel free to answer however you'd like. What advice do you have for young people? And you could take that in the context of your career, in the context of your speciality, and advice for how young people should behave. What is your advice?
Well, maybe I could give a piece of advice and then maybe a small story that undergirds it. Would that be useful,
That
perhaps?
sounds good.
My advice is simple and straightforward. Stay curious. Consider your curiosity as precious as your physical health. Curiosity is an extraordinary thing to have. It has staying power. I love Dorothy Parker's great take on it. She said, "The cure for boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity." I haven't had a boring day in 40 years. I can't believe I get paid to do what I do. It's been so lovely to be a part of that. And now the origin story from where all this comes,
Mhm.
so that for young people that are thinking eventually you're going to start a family, have your own kids, or maybe you're still in a family where this can work. The story is this. My mother was a fourth grade teacher. It's the best teacher I ever saw. This is what she would do, Drew, my entire life, up until I was about 12 or 13 when I started doing this on my own. This is what that woman would do. She said she would just wait because she saw that my natural curiosity, that I would be interested in something. So say I was interested in dinosaurs, which I was for a period of time. You know what she did? She filled the whole house with dinosaurs. These little plastic manipulatives. She put on timelines so that I could see what the Jurassic, Cretaceous, Triassic, all the timeline parts. We would create dinosaur food that she thought she would eat. She taught me to do that rude sound you make that's almost flatulence-like with your armpit, because she felt that was the sound of a hollow cranial vault, what a dinosaur might actually sound like. No kidding. She said she would watch for what I was curious about and then aid it and abet it. Then the curiosity would go away for dinosaurs and it would remove, and she would see that my interest would wane. This is what she did. She said she would just wait. She waited until the next one came along. Down would come the dinosaurs. One was I was interested. I'm growing up in the 60s. So of course, I'm going to be interested in the Gemini, Mercury, Apollo projects, space. So when I got interested in space, you know what she did? Space everywhere, planets everywhere, galaxies as far as little models of rockets and all kinds of things, everything that was related to space. She did that over and over and over again until I was about 11 or 12 when I started doing this on my own, because I'd gotten it that my curiosity was a premium in her mind, that meant something to her, that I was curious. We would go. I'm an Air Force brat. We were actually stationed in Germany. We would go to the Louvre a lot. We were not all that far from it, just a train ride. She would try and recreate the pictures on the Louvre of a particular wall and put prints of those pictures on it, just so I could become familiar with it. To this day, I cannot escape. I have no escape velocity against her gravitational pull about curiosity. And so I say it to young people as I would say it to anybody, as I said it to my own two sons, who, by the way, are busy becoming scientists in their own right now. One's in graduate school, the other's ready to go to graduate school. Stay as curious as you can and make sure that you capture the staying power, because the cure for boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity, and I haven't had a boring day in 40 years.
My God, I love that story. Stay curious. Dr. John Medina, thank you so much for your time. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Drew, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. And to our audience, thank you for listening.